Welcome to Prove It, a workshop designed to help teachers meet and understand the needs of next generation testing by explicitly teaching text-dependent questions and evidence-based answers. Okay, on a little piece of paper, grab a pencil and reflect for a minute on what are the 3 ELA Common Core shifts. Explain the ways in which close reading is different than traditional reading, and how are text-dependent questions integral to close reading. So how is close reading connected to our new standards and our new Common Core shifts? You can pause the video now. Ask and answer questions to demonstrate understanding of the text, referring explicitly to the text as the basis for the answers. This is what the next generation testing questions look like. That is taken from this standard specifically. So that's why it's so important that we focus on that. How is the Common Core standards different than our previously taught standards? Well, you may have seen those differences already. There are 3 major shifts. It now uses and relies upon complex text, using evidence from the text, and building background knowledge. And that is mostly through nonfiction pieces. Today, we're going to focus on shift number 2, providing evidence from the text to answer text-dependent questions. Graphically, this is what it looks like. Those 3 pieces really do go together, even though we're focusing on just one today. Focusing on shift number 2, reading and writing grounded in evidence from the text, literary and informational. PARCC focuses on students rigorously citing evidence from the text throughout the assessment through selected response item. These are also commonly known as Part A and Part B questions. Part A is always the text-dependent question, and Part B is always locating the evidence that supports that answer in the text. And that can be through thick and thin questioning. The evidence might be there right in front of you, or you may have to make an inference to find the evidence. PARCC includes questions with more than one right answer to allow students to generate a range of insights that are substantiated by the evidence from the text. And PARCC also requires writing to sources rather than writing to decontextualize expository prompts, which include citing evidence that supports the responses. So the essay question look a lot different. Through PARCC, it will ask the question, but then it will ask the student to go back and provide evidence for their writing. It's just not opinion writing anymore. And this is done through 3 different types of questioning on PARCC. There is evidence-based selected response, which are typically the multiple choice questions. There's technology-enhanced constructed response, where those would be administered only online, and it captures the student's comprehension of text in ways like drag and drop, cut and paste, and moving things around to correct categories to show the relationships between their answers. And the third way is a range of prose constructed responses. And this is always the most difficult one because you need to move back and forth between multiple texts, but you need to provide evidence for your written answers, as traditionally known as an essay, where they can communicate they have an understanding of what they've read and connecting it directly to their writing. So what are text-dependent questions? According to Common Core state standards, students will need to go back to the text and read it 2 or 3 times and analyze the text in order to find the answers to text-dependent questions. And this is where close reading comes in. Close reading typically requires a student to read the same text 3 times. And you may be familiar if you've done any PARCC practice test. There's a Part A question, which the main idea that is found directly in the text, or you infer it. And Part B shows you which sentence from the article best supports your answer to Part A. So it's asking you to explicitly define where your answer came from. What does it look like on the computer? Drag and drop 3 details from the story. This is just an example from the cougar and the cricket that helped create the setting of the story. And to the side, students would have a list to choose from, and they would just need to drag and drop the information into the correct category. Is it a detail? Is it the main focus, in this case, the setting? Students need to drag and drop it into the correct spots. What does this look like in a prose constructed response? Essays. In the passage, the author developed a strong character named Mayax. Think about Mayax and the details the author used to create the character. So that's where your character analysis comes in. If a student can't analyze characteristics of the character, they will not be able to answer a question like this. The passage ends with Mayax waiting for the black wolf to look at her. Write an original story to continue where the passage ended. Be sure to use what you have already learned about the character as well as what happens to her next. And this is the difference between a student just continuing a story with their opinion and examining the story closely, because to do this correctly, the student would have to make a list of what characteristics they find in that character, and then based upon those characteristics, they continue it based on those characteristics, not just whatever their opinion is. So it's evidence-based to the text, and that's actually quite tricky to do. What do all these question types have in common? Through the intentional and purposeful close reading and through thoughtful text-dependent questions is how we're going to prepare students for next generation testing. And now that you know the root of next generation testing, how does this change and drive our instruction every day in the classroom? The most powerful tool at your disposal is easier than you might ever imagine. It is through daily oral questioning. Written questioning is important, but students hearing those higher level questions every single day is where they're going to become used to it. And you want to select complex text, which inspire thought, curiosity, and debate. If the text doesn't have much of a plot and it has no depth to it, it's really hard to create text-dependent questions at higher levels with text like that. And for that, I would always look at the Lexile scores. The higher the Lexile score within their range, that's going to tell you the comprehension and the complexity of the text. Expect students to provide evidence from the text every day, whether you're in a guided reading group and you're just questioning them orally. Expect those evidence-based questions every single day in some format. What is close reading? We have to have students reread the text.
I'm Josh Bicknell with McGraw-Hill Education, and I'm talking today to Douglas Fisher about close reading and how it relates to the Common Core state standards. So Doug, how would you describe close reading? How would you define it?
A close reading is a careful and purposeful reading. Well, actually, it's a rereading. It's a careful and purposeful rereading of a text. It's an encounter with a text where students really focus on what the author had to say, what the author's purpose was, what the words mean, what the structure of the text tells us. It really is what Louis Rosenblatt talked about as a transaction between the reader and the text. Louis Rosenblatt, the originator of reader response theory, really talked about understanding what the author had to say, and not including those author's words, but really getting what the author had to say and bringing some of your own ideas to bear on that text. In the close reading, we have to have students reread the text questions, text-dependent questions that require that they go back into the text and search for answers. Not typically call questions just the facts of the text, but rather questions that allow students to think about the text and the author's purpose and the structure and the flow of the text. Close reading requires that students actually think and understand what they're reading.
Thanks, Doug. That was a great answer. My second question for you has to do with Common Core State standards in close reading. So is close reading part of addressing the Common Core State standards? Can you elaborate?
Close reading is in the Common Core State standards. However, an analysis of the Common Core State standards really says you can learn the text well. The Common Core State standards require that students provide evidence and justification for their answers. The only way we know how students can do this, that they really learn to provide evidence and justification, is if they closely read. When we have students really read carefully, they pay attention to the words, the ideas, the structure, the flow, and the purpose of that text, they're ready to answer the more complex questions that require that they really think about what the author said and compare that with what they know, what they believe, and what they think.
Doug, thank you so much for talking to me today about close reading and the Common Core State standards. Maybe next time we'll talk to Doug about what close reading looks like in the classroom. So stay tuned. Thank you.
So to recap that, although the Common Core does not explicitly say we're supposed to teach close reading, the only way to achieve the standard is through close reading. So it really is very important. Close reading typically requires, so what is close reading? What does it look like in a classroom? What would you expect to see? You would expect to see a student read a text or passage 3 times. Each time they read, the questioning that you use with your students needs to deepen. If you're looking at Bloom's taxonomy, you would use the application, knowledge, questions at the bottom of that for the first read. The second read, you would use the middle questions. And then by the time the students go to the third read, that's when you're asking, creating, generating, evaluating type questions to higher level, because each time they read it, they should be getting more out of the text, and they should be more ready to answer those higher level thinking questions at the very top of Bloom's taxonomy. How does close reading align to the Common Core ELA? Well, with the first read, this is going back to the standard. What does the text actually say in RL and RI 1, 2, and 3? Close reading addresses those 6 standards. Refer to specific details when explaining the text, describing the characters, setting, or event, citing specific evidence that supports your answers. Thin questions. The answer's right there in front of you. All you have to do is point to it. Identify the main idea and key details from the text. Summarize the text. Explaining procedures, ideas, or concepts. Those are all things that are going to be right there in front of the student. Those are the kinds of questions you would ask on the first read. With the second read, you're going to take it up to the next level, and students are going to hone in on the next 3 standards, which are 4, 5, and 6 for reading literature and informational reading both. Determining the meanings of words, phrases, or sentence. I know that word means whatever based on the information I got from the sentence around it. Explaining the structure of the text. Is it compare and contrast? What kind of structure is the text? Compare and contrast points of view and differences in the first and third person narrations. Compare and contrast first and second hand accounts of the same topic, and that would be through multiple texts. And we all know that PARCC uses 2 or 3 different texts where students have to be able to do that. For the third read, this is your highest level, which addresses RL and RI 7, 8, and 9. What is the value of the text? In what ways does this connect with other texts? Explain how the author uses evidence to support their own point of view. Interpret information presented and explain how it contributes to the understanding of the text. So if students don't have a background of text features or text structure, they will not be able to go to the next level in 7, 8, and 9. Integrating information from multiple texts on the same topic to write knowledgeably, that means the essay questions are not just opinions anymore. Students have to be able to go back and find evidence for their response. Well, the character did this because earlier I saw these characteristics, so I can predict the character might do this. Teacher and student roles in close reading. In your classroom, what would it look like? You want to select challenging and appropriate text. I call that complex text. And if you're looking at Lexile scores, you will know if a text is complex for close reading or not. Anticipate potential challenges the text may present. You always want to read and be familiar with the text before you use it in your classroom. Writing text-dependent questions that engage students. Lead rich and rigorous conversations, debating. Ensure reading activities stay closely connected to the text. Read the text more than once. And unfortunately, our kids across the board are really in the habit of only reading a text one time and then they're done with it. That is a habit and a way of thinking that we really have to change. That to get the most out of the text, it absolutely requires three reads. And that's something that, a habit that just has to be developed through practice. Persevere in reading and comprehending challenging text. Analyze the text for purpose and different purposes and different levels of meaning. And that happens as your questions become more difficult. Use evidence from the text to ask and answer questions. Increase comprehension of a text through multiple rereadings. And then participate in rich and rigorous conversations about a common text. Good text-dependent questions. Ask students to analyze paragraphs, sentence by sentence, word by word, paragraph by paragraph, or text to text. Investigate how meaning can be altered by changing keywords, and why did an author choose to use certain vocabulary. Probe each argument in persuasive text, each idea in informational text, and key idea in literary text, and observe how these build to a whole thing. You always want to keep the idea of what's the big idea in your mind when you're teaching this. Examine how shifts in the direction of an argument or explanation are achieved and the impact of those shifts. Question why authors choose to begin and end the way they do, or maybe even why the author chose specific text features. Why did the author write that in bold print? Why did the author put an illustration with that? How does the illustration support what the author is saying? All of those things are tied together. Note and assess patterns of writing and what they achieve. And when an author is asking a student to make an inference, why do you think the author left that open-ended? Why do you think the author wants you to infer based on clues that you already have about the text? And this is Bloom's taxonomy that you can use to create questions. Knowledge and understanding, describe, explain, remember, those basic is where you begin after the first read of the text. Then you would use applying and analyzing questions for your second read, and then evaluate, create, generate those things upon the third read. And if they've been successful in the first and second read, it is logical that they can do those higher level thinking questions at the top. It is unlikely students would not be able to answer the top 2 questions upon a first read. And a lot of times, that's what we ask students to do. We ask students to do one read, and then we give them different types of questions. And truly, developmentally, they're not ready for that because they haven't had the foundation or the groundwork laid for them to do that. And there's a sample of different levels of questions. I will just wait a minute and let you read those on your own. You can see how those questions build. But like I said, you really need to create the habit in the students that they're not going to get to those higher level questions unless they read and reread. What does it look like in your classroom? What things can you do daily to help students get ready for the questions of how do I provide evidence? What can you do to help them at any grade level be ready to answer those questions? Well, this chart, prove it and text evidence, because the text states, and then students go back and specifically look for the answer, say it's a shared reading. And students can go up and contribute and write how they know what they know. This was for author's viewpoint. Sometimes readers can tell how the author thinks or feels by what the characters say and do. And if you notice, that question, this question is directly related to the PARCC question that was earlier in the presentation. This gives students an opportunity to think deeply about that question and then put some of their answers up. And I would leave these kinds of charts and anchor charts posted in your classroom so students really get used to A, seeing the questions, and B, how do I respond to that question? I love sticky notes. For the question of drawing conclusion, and you can see the text there, authors don't always explain everything that happens in a story. You need to draw conclusions and make inferences based on the story that was a shared read aloud. Each student took a sticky note and wrote why they felt the author didn't explain everything and what the inference was, and why do you think the author left that and didn't tell you explicitly? How does that change the meaning of the text? That's a deep thinking question, and you wouldn't get there. I would not ask that question upon the first read. That's a question I would ask on the third. Readers look back in a story to answer their questions. And I love how the yellow highlights the direct evidence from the text, and that is a really good strategy for students, is to go back and highlight evidence. When I was in second grade, I had students just take a yellow crayon and highlight the specific evidence that matched the question, and then they would write the number of the question next to what they had highlighted. So when I looked at their work, I could see that's their evidence for number one, that's their evidence for number two. Students really get used to providing evidence for their questions when they're practicing it daily. Readers respond. How do people find out common ground text evidence? And again, this is just, there are hundreds of ways to present this in your classroom on all different kinds of charts for every single grade level. But just putting it out there, having students getting used to answering daily by providing evidence and not just giving the answer, but providing the evidence, that's how they're going to become ready for next generation questions. And that also means they're rereading the text 3 times. Just another way to show it. Something that really is huge in next generation testing is being able to access quotes from the text. A lot of times, the Part B questions will be all quotes. Which one of the quotes from the story best support that answer? So students need to understand what quotes are and be able to go back and find them in the story and then determine, okay, which one is the best piece of evidence for that question? That sounds easy, but there's a lot of steps. There's a lot of thinking steps a student needs to go through to get that correct. Misconceptions. Don't take the questions too literally. Locating evidence usually involves making inferences or drawing conclusions and the use of figurative languages, and those are tricky things. Most of the time on next generation testing itself, the answer is just not in a thin question. It's just not right there in front of you. The student will need to be able to do those higher level thinking to get those questions correct. But you lay the groundwork by starting with literal or thin questions. That's how they're, and you grow them to this point. Here's a list of sample text-dependent questions. I'll give you a minute to read over those. Did you notice some were thick questions and others were thin questions? Can you determine which are which? So what do you think? 1, 2, 3, and 4. Do you think each of those is a text dependent or not? Why did the North fight the Civil War? Lincoln says the nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Why is equality an important value to promote? What can you infer from King's letter about the letter that he received? What makes Casey's experiences at bat humorous? Do you think number 1 is a text-dependent question or not? It should be, but that's where it gets tricky because a student will likely want to interject their own opinion in those questions. But our job is to guide them back to the text and have them provide evidence as to what the author was saying, not what their opinion is. And that is a huge shift. Why is equality an important value to promote? That is not a text-dependent question. That's clearly an opinion question. That is in no way a text-dependent question. And what can you, if the question's asking an inference, then you need to go back to the text and reread it and make your inference based on that. So that one is. And what makes Casey's experiences at bat humorous? You would have to go back to the text and look for the experiences and think about, well, what makes that funny? Okay, now that we've gone through creating text-dependent questions, what they look like, what they don't look like, and providing evidence, pause the video and jot down 3 ELA common shifts, which we started out with. What are the 3 ELA common shifts that lead us to next generation testing? Explain the ways in which close reading is different than any traditional way we've ever taught reading. And how are text-dependent questions integral to close reading? This is the most important question. How are text-dependent questions tied or connected to close reading? You can pause the video now. Okay, hopefully, as you reflect back on your 3 answers, you have found that the answers are, the 3 common shifts are complex text, close reading, and building knowledge through the use of nonfiction text. Hopefully you can see the connection between close reading and next generation questions, that the days of reading a text once, or I call it doing a drive-by, those days are truly over if our kids are going to be successful. It requires 3 readings, and you might get pushback from students. I read it once. That is a shift in thinking that if we don't change that, students are not going to go back and reread it 3 times because they won't understand that each time the questions are going to become more difficult. So I think that is the most important thing we can walk away with. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please contact me.